G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.23 Battle for the New Testament, Part 3, the Reformation. In the last episode, I pursued the long and winding tale of how we arrived at the current collection of books we now call the New Testament. It was a protracted process, one that operated behind closed doors. All we know is that by 400 or so, when the empire was falling apart, both Greek East and Latin West had agreed on the same collection of 27 books. But that's only one part of the story of how the New Testament was made. Sure, everyone had agreed on which books were holy and which not. That was the first step. The next step was to decide on the contents of each book. The ancients squabbled long and hard about which books to include in their new canon. They were a lot more relaxed about the contents of each book. A good analogy would be the modern attitude to Shakespeare's plays. Say you get invited to see a production of Shakespeare's Taming of the Hedgehog, an engaging comedy about a socialite's attempts to woo her pets into submission. You might raise your eyebrows in puzzlement. No such play. Think I'll give it a miss. How about Titus Andronicus? Fine. You would not give a rat's patootie about which scholarly text of the play the company used. This line of the play is present in some of Shakespeare's editions, but not in others. Who cares? It's still Titus Andronicus, right? The idea that somewhere out there is the one true original of each book of the New Testament, and that it is important to recover that original, is a thoroughly modern preoccupation. Until the age of printing, no one really cared. You can find any number of Christian books and inflammatory websites charging that their favourite edition of the New Testament is holy and pure, and their opponent's edition is wickedly corrupt. Let's just drop that word corrupt from our vocabulary. As I will discuss at length, the entire concept is misleading and irrelevant. The Jews had long ago taken a very strict approach. During the early Middle Ages, a group of scholars we call the Masoretes worked to construct a fixed and permanent text of the Jewish scriptures. They took it upon themselves to copy the biblical books with great care, to preserve the texts from generation to generation. A single error of transcription, a single wrong letter was a sin. They invented mechanisms to ensure the text was copied with immaculate fidelity. Christians were positively cavalier and slapdash. There were hundreds of manuscripts of New Testament books floating around Christendom. Most churches in the Roman Empire had copies of the Gospels. In the East, the Diatessaron, the harmonized single Gospel of Tatian, was widely used. Many communities knew some of the letters of Paul. Some churches even had copies of Acts and the other letters. A few churches had copies of the book of Revelation. Very few congregations had all the books of the New Testament. All these manuscripts differed from one place to another. Sometimes the differences were very small, sometimes very large. The Gospel of Mark, for example, circulated in at least 3 different versions. In many manuscripts of the Gospel, Mark ends abruptly. After Jesus' death, Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome attend his tomb to anoint the body. They get the shock of their lives. Quote, Mark 16:5. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. End quote. This is where the Gospel of Mark ends, in our very oldest manuscripts. What a cliffhanger! Some scribes thought that was a rotten place to end the Gospel. They added another 12 verses, adding accounts of the ascension and Jesus' appearance to the disciples. Other scribes added yet another different ending. Which version of Mark is the original? Which copies of all those Gospels and letters floating around were accurate copies and which distorted? Does such a concept of original even make sense? Perhaps the author of Mark changed his mind about the ending. The problem was compounded by the fact that editions were written in Latin and Greek. No one doubted that every single New Testament book was originally written in Greek, but perhaps some of the Latin translations were more faithful to the originals than some of the Greek copies out there. The burgeoning church could not afford the starchy attitude of the Jews, who maintained that the subtleties of the Scripture can only be understood in the language that God decided they should be recorded in, Hebrew, or maybe Aramaic. There were arguments about that. Translation of Scripture into other languages was a fundamental part of Christianity's evangelical mission from the very beginning. The oldest of its scriptures were in Hebrew, the newest in Greek. But many of the Jesus followers spoke only Latin. Providing sound Latin translations from the original languages were tasks tackled many times in the early centuries of the Church. The Western Empire was awash with Latin translations of the Scriptures, a piecemeal mishmash of works, some good, some bad. These are known as the Old Latin translations, not because they were written in Old Latin, but because they were old and they were written in Latin. After the Empire made Christianity compulsory in 380, Pope Damasus appointed one Eusebius Hieronymus as his private secretary. He's better known as Saint Jerome, one of history's most amiable saints. His mission was simple: compile a complete and accurate Latin translation of the Bible using the best Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. His translation came to be known as the Vulgate, meaning commonly used or popular edition. For more than a millennium, it was a powerful document that stabilised the Christian scriptures, cemented Latin as the key liturgical language of the West, and bolstered the papal claims to episcopal supremacy. It was the not quite official Latin translation of the Catholic Church until the 20th century. Jerome put a lot more effort into translating the Old Testament than the New Testament. Where Jerome spent years hunting out Hebrew texts of the Old Testament, he accepted whatever Greek texts of the New Testament he had to hand. He translated existing Greek versions of the Gospels, using manuscripts that closely resemble some of the very oldest we have, manuscripts dated to the generation before Jerome. Done with the Gospels, Jerome lost interest. Jerome's version of the rest of the New Testament books are only slightly revised from the Old Latin translations. Jerome's Vulgate was used alongside the Old Latin versions well into the early Middle Ages. As late as the 8th century, the English monk Bede referred to Jerome's translations as new, although they had been written 400 years earlier. Jerome's work is only first called a Vulgate by the inventive English monk Roger Bacon in the 13th century. No one through the High Middle Ages ever squabbled about which Latin translation of the Gospel of Matthew, say, was the one true version. Which translation you preferred was your own affair. You liked the Vulgate? Fine. You liked the Old Latin? Fine. And everyone in the West knew that the Greeks had the originals. So what was the point of bickering? The churches of the Greek East had no use for, nor interest in, Jerome's Latin translation. They had Greek manuscripts aplenty. From late antiquity to the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, no one in the East attempted to assemble an authoritative single text. Your city church used a different version of the Book of Acts to my city church. So what? It was all the same book, right? The invention of printing in Europe in the late Middle Ages radically transformed attitudes to the Greek and Latin New Testament. There was significant money to be made here. Printers could sell dozens of copies, perhaps even hundreds, to Europe's Greek and Latin-speaking princelings. But to do so, they had to convince those elites that they were buying a quality product, a product that used the best ancient manuscripts available. During the Reformation, Europe's brightest decided to remedy Jerome's lax and indolent reliance on old Latin manuscripts of the New Testament. Their job, like Jerome's, was to sort through the best manuscripts available, to compile a critical edition of the New Testament. But where Jerome had lazily used old Latin manuscripts, they would use Greek manuscripts. In the early 1500s, two very bright people competed to bring to the market polyglot editions of the Bible. A polyglot is an edition that incorporates parallel versions of the text in several languages: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, whatever. Polyglots were meant to be serious academic tools. The first project was launched by Cardinal Cisneros, an influential power broker and statesman in Spain from the time of the explorer Columbus and on. Toward the end of his life, Cardinal Cisneros initiated and financed a huge polyglot of the entire Bible. His Old Testament consisted of parallel columns of Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and the Greek Septuagint. His New Testament compared manuscripts of the Latin Vulgate against the best Greek manuscripts his team could find. His Bible has the magnificent name of the Complutensian Polyglot, so named after Complutense University of Madrid, one of the world's oldest universities. It was quite an achievement. The printers had to cut hundreds of new Greek symbols never used in print before. They must have gone nuts. A few years after the Cardinal embarked on his grand venture, the independent scholar Desiderius Erasmus began his own polyglot edition of the New Testament. Erasmus was 30 years younger than the Cardinal, and so had youth and stamina on his side. Erasmus is one of the towering figures of the early Reformation. He nimbly avoided the theological wars between Protestants and Catholics, and in so doing established himself as the greatest figure of Reformation humanism. Erasmus engaged in two parallel projects: a fresh collection of the Greek New Testament and a critical version of the Latin Vulgate. He was under the gun. He knew the Cardinal Cisneros was on the verge of publishing his own Latin and Greek polyglot. Erasmus had to get his book out first if he was going to make a buck out of it. The Complutensian project stalled on the Cardinal's death. That allowed Erasmus to publish his own polyglot in 1516, 4 years before the Spanish could. Erasmus' focus was on producing a critical edition and fresh translation of the Latin Vulgate. He was especially concerned to deliver more elegant Latin versions of the letters of Paul than those preserved in Jerome's Vulgate. he included the Greek text only to convince his readers that his Latin version was a faithful critical text. Erasmus fudged it. He only had access to 4 or 5 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament from the recently deceased Byzantine Empire, and these were written very late, after the time of William the Conqueror. Older scraps that came his way he ignored. He believed them erratic. Where he felt the Vulgate was inferior to the Greek, he changed the Vulgate. Where he felt his Greek manuscripts were poorer than the Vulgate, he changed the Greek. His Greek text was riddled with transcription errors. Even Erasmus said his work was rushed into print rather than edited. Here's just one example of the many problems that bedeviled Erasmus. In the Latin Vulgate, the first letter of John has this, quote, 1 John 5:7, and there are 3 who give testimony in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these 3 are one. And there are 3 that give testimony on earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood. And these 3 are one. End quote. This was regarded as one of the earliest confirmations of the nature of the Trinity. Erasmus was in a quandary. None of his Greek manuscripts had that exact passage from 1 John. They had, quote, 1 John 5:7. There are 3 that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these 3 agree. End quote. That was much shorter than the passage in the Latin Vulgate. The Greek manuscripts did not name the 3, nor say they were one. From such little discrepancies do major theological conflicts grow. The extra verses from the Vulgate are called the Johannine comma, where comma just means a clause. Erasmus excluded the comma from his early editions. Popular pressure compelled him to include the comma in his later editions. The comma was passed down to the King James Bible. The comma is now universally regarded as a late Latin addition. In modern Bibles, it is found only as a footnote. Europe never showed any interest in Erasmus' Latin work, but became entranced with his labours on the Greek text. Over the next few decades, many others produced Greek testaments. Erasmus had founded a whole new academic industry. One of the most influential Greek New Testaments was an edition produced by Robert Estienne, known as Stephanus, in 1551, years after Erasmus' death. Stephanus was born into a family of academic publishers. After emigrating from his native France to Switzerland, he published numerous works of grammar, editions of the great authors of antiquity, and school books. His masterpiece was a Greek edition of the New Testament. Stephanus had access to a dozen more Greek manuscripts than Erasmus had. Now, where Erasmus had made invisible editorial decisions about which portion of which manuscript to include where, Stephanus revealed his editorial decisions for all to see. Where he found documents that differed from Erasmus' Greek, Stephanus included these variant readings in the margins. Stephanus had invented the critical study of the New Testament. Stephanus had one more contribution to make to biblical studies. He was the first to divide the New Testament into verses, divisions that we still use today. There were more editions to come. An especially bad one was assembled a few decades after Stephanus by Theodore de Beza, the Protestant reformer who succeeded John Calvin in Switzerland. In the course of his academic life, Beza had stumbled on 2 massive Latin and Greek polyglots of the New Testament. Although he did not know it at the time, these documents were centuries older than anything used by Erasmus or Stephanus. Beza simply ignored them and came up with his own cockamamie Greek text. In 1633, a little more than a century after Erasmus decided to compile a definitive Greek text of the New Testament, his mission culminated with an edition published by a family of Dutch printers, the Elseviers. They mashed together the editions of Beza, Erasmus, and the Complutensian Polyglot. How good is that? They were confident that they had finally arrived at a definitive Greek edition of the New Testament. They proudly announced, "So you hold the text, now received by all, in which is nothing corrupt." Europe accepted that boast. Their edition was labelled the Textus Receptus, the received text. Soon after, that name was extended backwards in time to the whole collection of 16th century scholars who tried to construct critical editions: Cardinal Cisneros, Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza. With a stable Greek edition of the New Testament to hand, Protestant scholars thought it a grand idea to translate the Textus Receptus into the vernacular languages of their own countries. This was strictly a Protestant endeavour. The Catholic Church held that the Greek Textus Receptus as unnecessary and irrelevant. The Church had St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate, and that was that. Through the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church regarded with deep suspicion any attempt to translate the Vulgate into the vernacular. In 1400, translation into the vernacular was a criminal act in Catholic England. The first serious attempts to produce English language editions were launched during the reign of that most volatile of monarchs, Henry VIII. You took your life into your own hands, publishing an English language Bible in Henry's time. The homicidal king's theology changed from year to year, depending on his politics and the pregnancies of his wives. Translations were deeply political works. Did they support Henry's claims to be free of the Bishop of Rome, or did they not? William Tyndale, a gifted scholar from an English mercantile family, was the first to try. Tyndale relied on Erasmus for his translation. He completed the New Testament, but was then obliged to go into hiding. He finally went to Antwerp, where he was kidnapped and imprisoned. He ended his life charged with heresy, condemned to death, strangled and burned. Tyndale's associate, Miles Coverdale, compiled the first English translation of the whole Bible. He spent his years on the run, trying to find a country less intent on killing him than the one he had just escaped from. Quite a number of English translations were produced in the last years of Henry VIII, and the reigns of his daughters Mary and then Elizabeth, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible. Only the Geneva Bible had any endurance. That used the Textus Receptus of Stephanus. It was the first English language Bible to use both chapters and verses. The Geneva Bible was created in 1560 by dissident English Protestants hiding out in Switzerland during the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary. The Geneva Bible was the version preferred by the more lefty Protestants. When the Mayflower landed in America, the King James Bible had been circulating for a decade. The Pilgrims ignored it. Their Bible was the Geneva Bible, published 80 years before. Of course, the truly great English translation of the time is the King James Version, published in 1611. I'm going to delay my discussion of that until the next time. In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I'll show how scholars in the Victorian age and after overthrew the privileged position of the Textus Receptus and battled to create a wholly new critical text. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts and diagrams, check out my website www.historyinthebible.com.